Houston Film Fanatics, KPRC Radio. Thank you guys again so much for joining us today. Now, in just a few minutes here, we're actually going to get on the phone to talk to an indie director, Eddie Rosenstein, and he is the guy behind the new film, Freedom to Marry. Now, this film chronicles the final year on the road to the Supreme Court decision on gay marriage. Now, whether you feel one way or the other about gay marriage and LGBT rights, this is still a fascinating film for you to watch because it shows you what it takes to make absolute change in the world. It shows you the up and down struggles. You get to see both sides of the fight. And as I said, it's fascinating. The film centers around Evan Wolfson, and he has been referred to as the architect for marriage. He is the guy who has kind of led a good portion of this movement. And we'll actually be talking to him just a little bit. But first, let's hear what Director Eddie Rosenstein has to say. Eddie, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. Hey, Eddie, how are you doing? Thank you so much for talking with us today.
No, my pleasure.
Very, very excited about this movie. Now, Freedom to Marry, really, really hard-hitting documentary. I think it's great because it's reminding people of the journey that it took to get to where we are today. And I think it's a great film that's going to remind people about why it's important to still keep fighting and everything for their rights, for all of the freedoms that are still very much, up in the air today or in jeopardy. Tell me exactly how you got involved with this project and how you got involved with Evan Wolfson.
It's funny. I'm actually not gay, and this wasn't my issue my whole life. But, of course, I'm interested in having our nation live up to its promise and human rights. And so I've been interested in marriage for a long time, but especially so because I happen to have grown up with Evan Wolfson. Our families are really intertwined. Our parents are very close friends. So we weren't friends as kids because he's about 7 years older, which is like a lifetime when you're a kid. But I'd been following his career because my mom would call all the time and say things like, "Oh, Evan's on Face the Nation. What are you doing?" And so I've always felt like I was chasing behind him. I literally grew up wearing his hand-me-downs, and I've always felt just impressed by what he's doing. And so as I realized he was the architect of one of our great civil rights movements, and as a documentary filmmaker, I noticed that they were now in their final lap. This was the Supreme Court was finally taking the case after decades of trying to earn that opportunity. So I touched base and said, it's Eddie from the Hood. Who's making the film? And he said, you are. So 2 days later, we were off and shooting.
Nice. Now, one of the things that I liked when I was watching the movie, I noticed there wasn't a whole lot of, reenacted footage or anything like that. So, at what point during this whole process did you guys decide, okay, we need to start recording everything we're doing, we need to make a movie out of this?
Sleight of hand. I actually only came on board last year, the year of the Supreme Court battle, and so I filmed that entire year. But the trick is to show how far it had come from despised minority to part of the American fabric by the end, and so I really want to use that last year and that last battle as a way of showing the entire journey. So there is actually a lot of footage that you just don't know. It's pulled from stock footage and archival, and it's sort of woven into it. But I think the important thing is that you understand that this took a long time, and change doesn't come necessarily overnight. It takes tenacity and perseverance and creativity, and you have to be able to weather the losses and keep on going. This is real life stuff.
One of the things that I found really interesting was you guys took a focus on Texas. Of course, we're in Houston, and
hello.
Yeah, I know. So there was a pretty good chunk of the film where you're showing different speakers and of course the resistance side of things here, and I find it really refreshing to see this and seeing a successful side of things when there is so much kind of political turmoil going on still in the world, especially right now.
I'm so glad you say that. First of all, I don't think that documentaries all need to be depressing. A lot of the stories around us can inspire us and encourage us. And this is, we're all exhausted from the news cycle going on right now. Whatever side you're on, it's just everything's an attack. And of course, conflict gets ratings. But there are hero stories among us. And one of the hero stories is the people like Evan Wolfson and Mary Bonato and so many in this movement who threw civil rights on their back and said, we're going to get this done. We believe that this can be a better world. And in a lot of ways, why I started this story wasn't just having unique access to a really big story. It's a chance to tell my children. And my wife and I try to let our kids know that regular people can change the world, and this is possible. And it's just, I found it so refreshing to see people triumph and for America to actually seem hopeful.
I could not agree more. I mean, like I said, in the times we live in, it was definitely a breath of fresh air. And even if it is, coming from something that's already happened, it was just nice to see that, people, coming together can actually make a difference. Because I've noticed, I think that one of the things that I've seen with a lot of young people that are getting into activism and things like that, they worry that, we're doing these marches and we're doing these different things, but, not seeing instant results like I think a lot of millennials are used to, like that kind of flash in the pan stuff. It's seeing just the amount of time it takes.
They posted on Facebook 4 times. Why isn't it different yet?
Exactly.
Yes. And that's the truth, and that's why this story, I find it really important. And it took Evan 32 years, and a good chunk of that was just convincing the people who were already passionate about this cause, the people in the LGBT movement, that this was something that they could fight together to choose one particular goal. There's so many lessons about how to create progressive change, and then needing to show people that you can win hearts and minds. And you have to win in the court of public opinion first so that you can win in the court of law. But that can be done. You can help people understand what you need and who you are and that you're a person deserving equal treatment or at least respect. That conversation can happen and it can be done safely, but it takes time and diligence and perseverance, and it's epic. There's people who've done this, and Evan shows us how we can do that. And I think you're right. The encouraging thing here is that this is a blueprint for how change can happen. And the nice thing is, to tell you the truth, we're now speaking to so many other movements and sharing these lessons so that they don't get stuck in that trap. We're talking to environmental movements and all sorts of rights groups and immigrant groups and people who really want to share their story and receive equal treatment as well.
For you personally, when you were putting this film together, what was some of the biggest challenges that you faced?
Well, it was a challenging project because, as I said, as a straight person, I was jumping on a moving train kind of late and needing to understand as much as I could of the landscape as the train was moving. That came out kind of good. That was actually metaphor. That was poetic.
It was
thank you. So I had to try to understand the history of the community and the fights, and while I'm raising money, while I'm shooting, while I'm convincing people to go on camera, while I'm trying to hear out the opposition to marriage and frame their story correctly or empathetically. And so just the amount of stuff coming at me at one time was the biggest challenge. But there was a lot of good people who, helped guide me through all of those considerations. And then the biggest challenge, of course, is it's a movement. Much of why this movement is impressive to me is how the movement itself helped people to share their story and convince them that they needed to and train them to do it safely because, of course, sharing your story, coming out at the water cooler, at the family, Thanksgiving table, or at the church, and saying, well, same-sex marriage means something to me, and here's why, and this is why it's important, and how it's hurting me and my family not to have this available. That puts them oftentimes at great jeopardy. It's a really brave thing to do. It's sometimes incredibly terrifying, and so how do you provide a safe way or a way for people to be able to have that conversation? But that's the conversation that needs to happen. So it takes a long time to train people, to support them, to help them understand this can be done, to give them, enough ad campaigns, messaging, structure, so that people can do that safely without losing their jobs, their community, their family. So not being able to tell all of these stories, all of the heroes involved in this movement was a great pain in my heart, having to just narrow it down to some stories that hopefully convey the essence of the journey. That was a challenge.
I was watching the movie and of course, obviously we know the ending of this film already from even before you start watching it. But was there ever a point where things were getting closer to the actual Supreme Court decision and maybe you guys were starting to sweat a little what happens if this doesn't go the way that we want it to?
Sure. Yeah, what did we screw this up? Yeah, I know. Yeah, well, that's the journey of being a documentary filmmaker, is you throw out a big dramatic question of will we blank, and you don't know the answers, until it's pencils down and there is a conclusion. So the will we blank was will we win, and it's my job to, as a storyteller, to try to make that as real and compelling as I can so that the audience goes on that journey and cares one way or the other, so that if it turns out that the answer is no, they don't win, it's still a question of no, but, well, what happens when the nation doesn't live up to its promise? What happens when we are not a free and just society where everyone can have equal rights? How does that affect other people when you're not the one who's on the equal side? All of those questions are then magnified. So if they lost, it's still a compelling film. I'm just, very happy to see that that's not what happened.
I think that there's a lot of people out there that are very thankful that that's not what happened. So, yes, we're very, very, very excited. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I was tearing up at the end of this film because there's, I don't know, it's just the overwhelming feeling of joy coming from watching these scenes where these people are, it's finally happened after all these years. I mean, it was a really intense but wonderful experience to watch.
Hope is contagious, and hope is wonderful, and it's so great to be able to just breathe it in,
Absolutely.
So part of it, I think part of the experience, the emotional feeling at the end of it that you felt is just like, wow, good things can happen, and it's just nice to experience.
Absolutely. My last question for you is, in the whole process of doing this, of course, you say, you're not gay, but you're suddenly immersing yourself in this movement that's really, gaining, momentum. How has making this film and putting this together changed you?
Yeah, I have the opportunity as a documentary filmmaker to go into worlds. I spent, 3 years as a union miner making films about miners. I spent, a year in crack houses and drug rehabs in Harlem. I've spent a year in the Jewish senior citizen community in Florida, which was probably the most hazardous situation I was ever in. And, so it's, I just really enjoy being able to go into communities and meet people that, inspire me. But I think what this really showed me is and how it changed me is, I think in my heart I believed that change was possible and regular people can make a difference, and that by sharing our stories, which is something I've chosen to do for a living, telling people stories and hoping that makes a difference. And I know this isn't necessarily about LGBT things, because I don't know if my opinion changed that much about LGBT issues through this. But what I learned is that people really can make a difference, and sharing our stories really does change things. I believed it, but now I've seen it, and I've experienced it. And so I'm just inspired and impressed. And right now, where we're in a situation where so much of our country seems so difficult, and I've learned that sometimes you can just turn off MSNBC or Fox News or whatever it is that works you up into a lather. You can turn it off for a few minutes. You can catch your breath. We don't always have to be screaming at each other, because really the important thing is to listen to each other. And when we listen to each other, an incredible thing can happen, which is there's always going to be 20% on one side that disagree with you, and there's always going to be 20% on the other side that agree with you. There are those margins, the people on the edges who take up a lot of the space on our television and in our news. They're always going to be there. But that means that there's 60% of the people in the middle who are reachable, and maybe not yet reached, but are willing to hear each other and care about each other and do the right thing and take care of each other. And that's inspiring. And I have great hope. At the end of this film, I have great hope.
Well, I definitely recommend everybody goes and checks out Freedom to Marry. This definitely is a very hopeful and positive film that I think everyone should see. Eddie, thank you so much for talking with us today. I really do appreciate it. Once again, Eddie Rosenstein, thank you so much for joining us. Stay tuned, everybody. We'll be back in just a bit talking with Evan Wolfson, who is the basically the center of the marriage equality movement, and he is the star of the film Freedom to Marry. So don't go too far. Houston Film Fanatics, KPRC Radio. We'll be right back.